awesome. All right. Hi, everybody, if there's anybody there. Um, Ken Benton here from the North Branch Nature Center. And I'll wait a minute or two before we dive in all the way. Let's see if we get some folks here viewing. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to make a terrarium, or as I like to call it, life in a jar. And you can make terrariums as big as you like. I have a terrarium at home that's 20 gallons, and we have a crayfish in it. We have a water feature in there, some land, sculpted background. You can get as complicated as you want. But today we're going to go very simple, very basic, and small and handy. Before we make a new one, I'm going to show a couple examples here of some that I've made in the past. Here we have an old jar with a cork lid. This jar is very special to me, actually. It was bought with a gift card that my wife and I were gifted when we got married. It was a gift card to Bed Bath & Beyond. We went in there, got all of our stuff, and this was our first jar of sea salt together. And it's very near and dear to my heart. It reminds me of those early days with my wife in our little apartment in Keene, New Hampshire. But it was a cool jar. After we used all the sea salt, I looked at it and I just couldn't bring myself to throwing it away. So I held on to this jar for almost 10 years, almost a decade. This empty jar was sitting in my cabinet. And this March, we got into quarantine and I was bored and I was poking around online and I saw this guy was making tiny terrariums in jars. I thought that was really cool. So guess what? I went into my cabinet, got this empty jar, 10-year-old jar of sea salt with the awesome cork lid, and I made a little terrarium. And I held it up to my wife and son, and I told them that exact story that I just told you about this lovely jar. And it now sits on our kitchen table, and we can eat around it every night. So, how do you make these? They're pretty easy, but you do need a few things. First, you need a jar. It doesn't need to be a 10-year-old jar of sea salt commemorating your marriage. It could be just something out of your recycling. All right. Here's one I made a couple weeks ago. This was a salsa jar. All right. And I washed it out as best I could. I sniffed it afterwards, and it still smelled a little bit like salsa, which is okay. Get it as clean as you can. And things about jars like that, they have these labels on them, right? So here's an empty jar of Teddy all-natural peanut butter. This is the smooth, unsalted version. The chunky version works just as well for your terrariums. It doesn't matter. But some of these containers, it's harder to get that label off, like this one. I was going to use this one today, and I started peeling it. You can see in the corner right there, it's peeled off partially. But there's a lot of glue on here, and I thought, I don't have time for this, and just set it aside. And I got a spaghetti jar. This was a Newman's Own spaghetti. And they only had the glue on the very back strip here, so it's really easy to peel off. And you can see there's a little, well, you might not be able to see it. It's a little cloudy right here and it's still a little sticky. If you're really persnickety and don't want that on there, or to get these labels off that are more heavily glued, you can fill a bucket of water or fill your sink up with water and put some white vinegar in there as well, and just let it soak. And that vinegar, the acid in the vinegar, is going to help break down that glue. So it's going to be nice and shiny, and you can see right through it. All right, those labels should peel right off. And hot water works a little bit better than cold water for that. So you need a jar. It doesn't have to be glass. It can be plastic. Plastic works just as well. All right. You need some rocks. All right. So before going live here, I went out to the driveway here at the Nature Center and picked up some pebbles. They can be tiny, they can be a little bit bigger, like this one here. Doesn't really matter. Just no giant boulders inside your jars. All right. I'll tell you what those rocks are for in a minute. You need a plastic bag. You need, you don't need it. This is an optional one, but charcoal helps. I'll tell you why in a minute. You need some soil. I scooped up some soil earlier. Garden trowel really helps. You can scoop up soil with your hands, but get the dirt under your fingernails. You might not like that. So having some sort of digging tool is helpful. You definitely need some scissors. You need some sort of marker. I like the permanent markers. And you need a sharp, pointy stick. All right. And lastly, but definitely not least, you need some sort of plant matter, some vegetative matter. I have some moss in my hand right here. This is really dry moss. I also have some moss in this bag. This is a little bit that I scraped off from the roof of my garden shed. I got a bunch of moss growing up there and you really need to clean the roof off. But it's handy for this. You can also get moss out of your yard. We have a very patchy backyard, so in between those patches of grass, you can get some moss growing in there. And here's a patch from our yard here. Now, when you're harvesting moss, you want to be mindful that it is a living thing and it does support a habitat for other living things. So don't take more than what you need. And if you're pulling a patch out, make sure you're covering it back up with either leaves or kind of squish the moss back in around it. All right? All right. You could also add some little decorations. I got some acorn caps here that we might add. You could put a little stone in there. Maybe you have a little piece of stick that can act like a little log inside your terrarium. Lots of things you can do. You can make it as fancy as you want or as plain as you want. All right. So you also need, lastly, a little bit of water. All right. So let's start putting this together. I'm going to take my jar. I'm going to take my plastic. I'm going to lay it down nice and smooth and put your jar on top of it. All right. Next, you're going to take your marker and you're going to trace as best you can around the base of your jar. All right. So you're going to end up with a circle drawn on your plastic. All right. Make sure you cap your marker so it doesn't dry out. Take the jar off, and you now have a circle drawn on your plastic bag. Next, you're going to take your scissors, and you're going to cut that circle out. And if it's not perfect, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. Just get it as close as you can there. Cut all the way around the circle. And this is going to serve as a little bit of a barrier between two different layers in your terrarium. Take the plastic bag, set it somewhere. The wind's not going to blow it away. All right. So now we have a little plastic circle. Gonna set that aside for the moment. Take your jar. If you don't have these materials right now, that's fine. You can go back and watch this video later after you've collected some materials. And I'm going to take my rocks here. I'm going to sprinkle them in. If you're using a glass jar, be mindful of how hard you're putting your rocks in. You don't want to crack the bottom. But these little pebbles probably aren't going to do any damage to the glass. If it does, I'm going to be talking to Newman's Own and have a little beef with them. So we make better glass. And you got to keep putting it in there until you get about, well, depending on the size of your jar, the height of your jar. This jar I'm going to put in about an inch, inch and a half of rocks. All right. You want to have it about, I'm going to say, maybe a fifth or a sixth of the way filled up. I'm getting there right now. Awesome. That looks pretty good. All right. Give it a little pat like that, and that'll help even those rocks out, smooth them out a little. Now, what these rocks are going to do, they're going to serve as a drainage layer. And that's going to be really important because you're going to have to water your plants. And if there's too much water in there, you want somewhere for it to go so it doesn't just sit in that soil and create an environment that's too moist and can start rotting a bit. That's not a good thing. You don't want rot in your jar of life because then it's a jar of death. And nobody wants a jar of death sitting on their counter. All right, so we got our plastic here. I have a bamboo skewer, so it's a little wooden stick with a pointy end. You could just use a stick from your yard. You could use a fork. You could use your scissors. Be careful with that if you're using any sharp metal objects. I have a foam pad since I'm working on a table here as a surface that I can puncture the holes on. If you don't have a foam pad and you're doing it outside, you could just take your plastic circle, stick it on the ground, and use that ground as the soft surface underneath. It doesn't work too well if you're using on a hard wood surface because that stick is just, that pointy end of the stick's just going to go through and hit that hard wood and might not go all the way through the plastic. All right, so now I'm going to just pin cushion this. Go all over. You want a bunch of tiny little holes in there. All right, and the point of this is to allow some water droplets to go through that layer of plastic, but not all of it draining down into the rocks. This plastic is gonna hold the soil above the rocks. Your drainage layer isn't gonna work if all the cracks in between those rocks, all the nooks and crannies, are filled with loose soil. Right? So you need something to hold that soil up out of the rocks that's also going to let water drain through. And that's what these little holes are going to do. It's going to let that water, that excess water, drain down into your drainage layer. We're almost there. I got a little bit on this side to do. It's really kind of fun to do this. It's very satisfying. Just make sure you don't poke yourself. You see I'm not raising it up really high and just stabbing at it. Just little pokes are good enough. All right, that looks pretty good. This is about what you want. Little perforations in there. All right, so now you're going to take your plastic and put it in your jar. All right, really recommend when you're making these for the first time, especially using a wide mouth jar so you can actually fit your fingers in there and move stuff around if you need to. All right, I made this one, and this was actually my first one, and I regret having this be my first one because, as you can see, it doesn't have a very big mouth. I can't even stick one finger in there, so I was taking little tweezers and like gently moving things around in there. It was a real pain, but it turned out all right. Easier with the wide mouth jar. So we're gonna get that in there. Now I can't reach my fingers all the way down into here. My hand's too big, but I have a stick. I take that stick, poke that plastic around, manipulate it a little bit, get it down in place. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to cover most of your rocks there. All right. All right. You want those edges kind of tucked down in between the glass and the rocks if you can get it that way. So it's going to look. Uh-oh. I think I'm dead. Sorry, we're having trouble playing this video. You can still see me? All right. I've been told that I can still be seen. So I'm going to keep going so far. So I can't see me, but maybe you can. So this is kind of what it's going to look like. You have your jar with the plastic over the rocks. All right. Now it's time to put some soil on your plastic. I'm going to move my foam out of the way so I don't spill a bunch of soil on it at this point. All right. So you can use your trowel to scoop it in here, or you can just use your fingers. I don't care if my fingers get dirty or not, so I'm just going to go ahead and do this. Now, depending on where you get your soil from, you might have some extra life inside there that you don't know about. There may be little nematodes crawling around in the soil. There may be some wood lice, the roly-polies. You might have some tiny millipedes in there. Might have some little worms. Who knows what's going to pop up in here after you seal this all off. That's really one of the fun parts of creating these for me, is seeing what else shows up after the fact. All right. There may be seeds in here in the soil that haven't germinated yet. So you could have some sort of wild, crazy plant that turns up and grows inside your jar. So I got about an inch or so. There's a little bit of a dip on one side, so I'm going to fill in that dip a little bit more. All right. I'm going to give it a tap again to kind of even that out, just like we did with the rocks. And if you need to, you could take your stick and move things around a little bit. Landscape in there. Maybe you want a little mountain in the corner. I recommend whatever side you want facing people, having that be a little bit lower. All right. You don't want a big hill in the front, because that's going to be blocking everything in the back, right? So I'm going to brush towards the back a little bit, creating a little bit of a slope. I'm choosing the back as this side because that's where the excess glue is still there. All right, that's looking pretty good to me. Now, an optional thing that I could have done, I didn't do this time, between the soil and the plastic layer, you can take some charcoal and crush it up and put it as a layer in between there. And what that's going to do is going to act as a little bit more of a filter. So any rotten matter, organic matter, decaying organic matter can go down and get filtered out through that charcoal. It's going to keep it a little fresher. I didn't do that this time. That's okay. It's an optional thing that you can do or not do. So now we're ready to plant this. So I'm going to take the moss from the roof of my garden shed, and you can take moss from just about anywhere. If you don't have a backyard, you can go walking down the sidewalks and look for the little cracks in the sidewalks, and you'll likely find moss there. Moss likes to grow up against the base of trees. Found some moss, this moss, up against an oak tree by the nature center. I recommend using moss rather than grass, because grass, what happens if you don't mow your yard? You get really tall grass plants, right? Not going to fit inside a jar. So I recommend using moss instead, unless you have a really big giant, like one of those big tubs of pickles. If you have one of those kicking around, maybe you want to have a little lawn inside there. Could be fun. So I'm going to eyeball this and tear a little bit of moss off. Get a little circle here, give it a little trim. I like that. Let's see, might need to take a little bit off the back here. And save that moss that you're peeling off too, because if you want to do another one, you can just piece together the little sections. And this moss is really dry. You can store it this way, or you can put it in a little container and with a little spritz of water, and it can keep that way for months and months. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stick that down in there. It's going to be my foreground. Take my stick and stick it into place a little bit better. All right, so we have something that looks kind of like this, right? There's a little gap right there, so I'm going to take another piece of moss and stick it down there. Smaller pieces. Just take that stick, move things around as you need to. All right, it's pretty good. Now I'm going to take some moss from the backyard, and that's going to be in my background, in the back corner there. All right, there's a little bit of grass there that's already kind of long and wilty, like this right here. I'm going to go ahead and just pinch that off, give it a little prune. All right. So now I'm going to take this. I might need to take a little bit more off, make it fit. Take it, put it down in the back there. Now I'm going to take my stick again, and push it down so it's really well fit inside there. All right. Awesome. It's getting a lot of contact with that soil. Now I'm going to put a couple decorations in there. I'll put a couple acorns, acorn caps. Go in there. Oh, that looks really nice. Okay. And one right on the other side too. All right. Put one facing up and one facing down for a little bit of contrast in there. All right. So now, hold this up so you can see it a little better. We have our terrarium. It's planted. It doesn't have everything it needs yet because that soil is pretty dry and plants need water to grow and live. So I got a spray bottle here. You don't have to have a spray bottle. You can use just a couple spoonfuls of water work well. I'm going to adjust the nozzle and I'm going to spray down in here and water it, make it rain. Get a few spritzes. And you want enough to just kind of moisten the upper part, the upper like quarter-inch of your soil. All right. You don't want a bunch of mud in there. That's not a good thing because you can overwater these, and you have too much moisture in there, too much for the drainage layer to handle. And again, if it's too moist, you can get some rot in there, and that's not a good thing. You end up with a jar of death instead of a jar of life. So I'm going to say that's pretty good. You can take a piece of paper towel and wipe the sides down if you have some excess moisture on there. And you might want to do that for some maintenance anyway. I'm just going to take my finger and wipe up right now, just so you can see that inside there a little bit better. You can see we have a little pond there in that acorn cap that I set upright. The water got stuck inside there. So that is our jar of life, and it is now ready to seal off. You do have to seal them off. That's important, because if you don't, any moisture that evaporates up or is transpired out from the plant's breathing, it'll just go right out the open cap, right? If it's opened up, it'll just go out and you'll lose it. If it's sealed up, that moisture goes up as little particles in the air, and then it condensates on the sides of the glass or on the top, and it drips back down and waters the plants again. So you have an enclosed water cycle here, right? Also, if there's little critters inside the soil, you don't have to worry about there not being enough oxygen for them. One, they don't need a ton of oxygen. Two, you have plants in here that are photosynthesizing, all right? They're going through photosynthesis, and they're creating oxygen in the air, all right? So you have enough oxygen in here too that's getting replenished all the time. So you have water, you have oxygen, there's CO2 in there, carbon dioxide, and yeah, the last thing it needs is sunlight, right? If you put this in a dark place or in a dark cabinet, guess what's going to happen? Everything, all the plants in here, it's going to die off. So you can set this on your on a windowsill, works great. If you have a table like our kitchen table, gets plenty of sunlight, you can set it right in the middle of your kitchen table. You can have it decorating a windowsill in your room, set it wherever you want. To maintain these, they do have a little bit of maintenance. You want to check on them every now and then to make sure everything's going good in there. You want that jar of life taking off and everything growing in there. All right. Now, Carrie, you don't want the jar of death, right?
I do not want jar of death.
Jar of death is not a good thing. That'd be a really good name for a hot sauce, by the way. Jar of death. Oh my gosh, that'd be perfect. Anyway, yeah. So to give these maintenance, every now and then you might want to take a look at it, open it up, and you want to give it a sniff. And it should smell like this one, which is really fresh. You can smell the grass and moss in there. It smells like life. It's a jar of life. That's a good thing. That's a sign that there's enough moisture in there and there's not too much moisture in there. All right. Take a look at it. There should be a little bit of condensation on the glass, maybe at dawn and dusk. So a little bit of condensation is a good thing in there. If you look at this one right here, you can see a lot of condensation in here. I watered this one too much initially. Again, this was my very first one. And it doesn't smell great. I need to leave the cap off of this for a little while to let more of that excess moisture evaporate out. I should take this little plug out too and stick some paper towels down in there and wipe the sides off as best I can to help remove that excess moisture. Because I do smell a little bit of rot in there. I'm looking at the plants in there and there's a little bit of decay, and that's not a good thing. All right. So I'm going to leave the cap off that for this one. It's hard for it to evaporate out because that hole is so tight. So I'll probably leave this open for a couple days. This one, it's not good. There's something not good happening in there. I don't see any rot, but there's definitely rot there because I can smell it. So this got overwatered, or it maybe got too hot. That could happen too. These are like little greenhouses, and you could start cooking your plants in there. Or if there's any soil creatures in there, like little nematodes or worms, they can cook too. Worms don't like heat. So this one I need to leave open for a while and reevaluate it. I might take it apart, put the moss back. The moss isn't dead, but there's something dead in here, and that's not good. So I'm going to leave this one open and let it air out, get rid of some of that excess moisture. If you notice that there's a lot of growth in here, eventually the moss will grow up the sides. You can see it growing up the sides a little bit on this one. Any plants that are inside there, like there's a fern in here that I had no idea was there when I first put it in. I just took a clump of moss out of the yard and stuck it in there. Turns out there's some ferns in there, and they started growing out. And it's the fern itself is too big for this jar, so it hasn't completely unfurled. So I can take some scissors, I can go in there and trim up a little bit, give it a little bit of a haircut, and then put the lid back on. And if you're doing that, and if you're working on it for a long time, and you notice that it's getting dried out, you can just give it another couple spritzes of water, but not too much, right? And once it's about right, you can leave these things closed for, some people leave them closed for like 2 years, and they're still growing in there if you get that balance just right. I recommend checking them once a month, especially if you're starting out and you're still working on getting those ratios just right. But they're really fun to watch. You can take, it's amazing what just a couple scoops of soil and a little patch of moss, just the amount of life that's in there. This jar, I took 2 scoops of soil from our backyard, a rock, and a little patch of moss, no bigger than the base of this circle here, right? And in here, there are a couple little worms crawling around. There's some nematodes in there. There's a little tiny baby millipede crawling around on the surface in here. There's at least 1 species of moss. There's a fern. There's some mouse ear chickweed growing in there. And it looks like we might have a sprout of some grass as well. And more species could show up over time as I continue to watch this, and this continues to grow. So that's our jar of life. It's a really fun project, really easy, doesn't take very long. It took longer just now because I was talking a lot and telling stories about my marriage, which is great. Hi, Lindsay, you're probably watching at home. So, yeah, it's fun to do, and it's fun to watch these over time and see how they progress. Yeah, and if you have any questions and we can't get to them right now, feel free to comment on this video, and I can go back at a later time and answer those questions as well. So, all right. So thank you, everybody. It's been great sharing this with you, and I hope you have a great day and you have a beautiful weekend. Take care. There we go. Wow, weird.